Can't sleep? Are you a fan of The Last of Us? Then this video is for you. We'll guide you through Joel and Ellie's epic adventure with a soothing voice and relaxing music, helping you drift off to a peaceful sleep. Experience the emotional journey of The Last of Us in a whole new way. This video recounts the entire story of Joel and Ellie in a calming voice, perfect for falling asleep to. Prepare to be transported to the post-apocalyptic world and drift off to dreamland. Tired of tossing and turning at night? This relaxing video, narrated in a soothing voice, will guide you through The Last of Us story, helping you fall asleep quickly and peacefully. Enjoy a restful night's sleep while reliving the emotional adventure of Joel and Ellie. Welcome, dear listener, to a journey through one of the most profound and moving stories ever told. As you settle into your comfortable space, perhaps pulling a soft blanket closer or adjusting your pillow, just so, let yourself be transported to a world where love transcends the darkest of circumstances. Tonight, we'll walk together through the complete story of The Last of Us, a tale that speaks to the very heart of what it means to be human, to care for one another, and to find hope even when the world seems to have forgotten what hope looks like. The Last of Us is more than just a story of survival in a world gone wrong. It's a meditation on the bonds that form between people when everything else falls away. It's about a gruff, weathered man who thought his heart had closed forever, and a spirited young girl who would teach him that even the most damaged souls can learn to love again. It's about sacrifice, about the weight of impossible choices, and about the small moments of tenderness that can bloom like wildflowers through the cracks in concrete. As we begin this peaceful retelling, let your breathing slow and deepen. Feel the tension leaving your shoulders, your jaw, the space between your eyebrows. We're going to take our time with this story, savoring each moment, each character, each quiet revelation that unfolds like petals opening to the morning sun. There's no rush here, no urgency except the gentle pull of narrative drawing us forward, step by careful step. Our story begins in a different world from the one we know now. It begins in 2013, in a small Texas town, where a man named Joel Miller was trying to build a simple, good life for himself and his daughter. The world was not yet broken. Children still played in suburban streets as the sun set in golden pools behind white picket fences. Families still gathered around dinner tables, sharing the small frustrations and simple joys of ordinary days. It was a world where a father's biggest worry might be whether his daughter was doing her homework, or whether he'd remembered to buy milk on the way home from work. Joel Miller was a contractor, a man who worked with his hands to build things that would last. He was the kind of man who knew the satisfaction of a job well done, of seeing a structure rise from nothing but plans and raw material. His hands were calloused from years of honest work. His back sometimes ached from long days spent framing houses or laying foundations. But these were good aches, the kind that spoke of purpose and productivity. More than anything else, Joel was a father. And if you've ever been a parent, or if you've ever been someone's child, you know that this simple fact colored every other aspect of his existence. Sarah Miller was 12 years old, on the cusp of becoming a teenager, still young enough to curl up next to her dad on the couch while they watched movies together, but old enough to roll her eyes at his jokes and to have her own opinions about the world. Sarah was the kind of child who lit up a room simply by entering it. She had her father's eyes, but where his had been weathered by years of adult concerns, hers still held that pure, uncomplicated spark that belongs only to the young. She was quick to laugh, quick to offer comfort when she sensed someone needed it, and possessed of that peculiar wisdom that children sometimes display, the kind that cuts straight through adult complications to the heart of things. On this particular evening in September, as the last light of day painted the sky in soft pastels, Joel was coming home from work feeling that familiar combination of tiredness and satisfaction. His truck rumbled up the driveway of their modest two-story home, the engine ticking as it cooled in the gathering dusk. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful in the way that suburban neighborhoods can be just before dinner time, when families are gathering themselves for the evening ritual of shared meals and homework and bedtime story. Inside the house, Sarah was curled up on the living room couch, Her homework spread across the coffee table in that organized chaos that somehow made perfect sense to her 12-year-old mind. The television was on, providing background noise as she worked through math problems and history questions. She looked up when she heard the front door open, her face brightening with the kind of uncomplicated joy that a child feels when their parent comes home. "Dad," she called out. And there was such warmth in that single word, such genuine happiness at his return. It was the kind of greeting that could wash away the fatigue of even the longest day. The kind of welcome that reminded Joel why he worked so hard, why he got up every morning and went out into the world to build things that would shelter and protect families like his own. Joel kicked off his work boots by the door, a habit Sarah had trained him into over the years. "Hey, baby girl," he said, using the nickname that never failed to make her smile, even as she was getting older and might have been expected to outgrow such childish endearments. "How was school?" Sarah launched into an animated account of her day, talking about a test she'd aced, a friend who'd made her laugh during lunch, a book she was reading for English class that she couldn't put down. Joel listened with the kind of attention that good parents give their children, not just hearing the words but listening for the emotions beneath them, the small victories and minor disappointments that make up the texture of a young person's life. As Sarah talked, Joel found himself really looking at his daughter, seeing her with fresh eyes. She was growing up so fast, changing almost daily in ways both subtle and profound. Soon she would be a teenager, then a young woman, then she would go off to college and build her own life. The thought filled him with a mixture of pride and melancholy, the bittersweet awareness that parenthood is, in many ways, the art of raising someone to eventually leave you. But tonight she was still his little girl, still happy to share her day with him, still content to exist in the warm circle of their small family. Tonight the world was still whole, still predictable, still filled with the comforting routines that make life feel stable and secure. After dinner, after the dishes were cleared and Sarah had finished her homework, they settled in to watch a movie together. Sarah chose something light and funny, a comedy that would make them both laugh, that would end the day on a high note. Joel settled into his favorite chair while Sarah claimed her usual spot on the couch, a soft throw pillow clutched against her chest. The movie played and they laughed together at the silly jokes and improbable situations. Joel found himself watching Sarah as much as the screen, treasuring these moments of simple connection. He was tired, as he often was after long days of physical work, and his eyelids grew heavy as the evening wore on. "Dad," Sarah said during a quiet moment in the film, "are you falling asleep?" Joel startled slightly, realizing he had indeed been drifting. "Just resting my eyes, baby girl," he said, using the classic parental excuse that fooled no one. Sarah smiled knowingly. "Why don't you go to bed? I can turn off the TV when the movie's over." Joel considered this, then shook his head. "Nah, I'm good. Want to finish this with you." It was such a small moment, such an ordinary exchange between a father and daughter, but it was also precious in its ordinariness, beautiful in its simplicity. Joel choosing to stay awake, to share this time with his daughter rather than surrendering to his exhaustion. Sarah showing concern for her father's well-being, already learning the art of caring for others that would serve her well in the years to come. The movie ended, and they made their way upstairs together, Sarah chattering about her plans for the weekend. Joel listening with half an ear as sleep called to him. At the top of the stairs they paused at Sarah's bedroom door. She stood on her tiptoes to give him a hug, and Joel wrapped his arms around his daughter, holding her close for just a moment longer than usual. "Love you, Dad," Sarah said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "Love you too, baby girl," Joel replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Sweet dreams." Joel made his way to his own room, performed the simple rituals of preparing for bed, and settled under the covers with a deep sigh of contentment. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, peaceful in the way that small towns can be late at night. Street lamps cast gentle pools of light on empty sidewalks. A few windows glowed with warm yellow light, but most houses were dark, their occupants already surrendered to sleep. Joel drifted off thinking about the weekend ahead, about maybe taking Sarah to see a movie, about the project he was working on that was nearly finished. Simple thoughts, ordinary concerns, the kind of mental meandering that accompanies the transition from wakefulness to sleep. He had no way of knowing that this would be the last normal night of his life. The last time he would fall asleep in a world that made sense. The last time he would take for granted the simple pleasure of a secure home and a safe child sleeping in the room next. The hours passed quietly. The neighborhood settled deeper into sleep. And in laboratories and medical facilities around the world, researchers were beginning to notice something troubling in their data. Something that would soon transform every assumption about what it meant to be human, about what it meant to be alive, about what it meant to survive. But for now, Joel Miller slept peacefully beside his daughter. A father in a world where being a father was still possible, still safe, still the most natural thing in the world. He slept deeply, dreamlessly, gathering strength for the trials that awaited him, though he could not have imagined their scope or their horror. The clock on his nightstand ticked steadily through the dark hours, marking time in a world that was about to change forever. Joel woke to the sound of his phone ringing, the shrill tone cutting through the peaceful quiet of the late night. He fumbled for the device in the darkness, squinting at the bright screen that displayed his brother Tommy's name. The clock read 2:47 a.m., and Joel's heart immediately began to race with the kind of fear that comes with middle-of-the-night phone calls. Nothing good ever happened at 2:47 in the morning. Tommy? Joel's voice was rough with sleep, but already sharpening with concern. Joel, thank God, Tommy's voice came through the phone, tight with barely controlled panic. You need to get Sarah and get out of town. Right now. Don't ask questions. Just go. Joel sat up in bed, suddenly fully awake. What are you talking about? Tommy, what's going on? It's everywhere, Joel. The cities. Jesus, I don't even know how to explain it. People are going crazy, attacking each other. It's like some kind of virus or something. The news is saying to stay indoors, but that's not enough. You need to get somewhere safe, somewhere remote. Joel's mind raced as he tried to process what his brother was telling him. A virus? What kind of virus? I don't know, man, but people are dying. And then they're not staying dead. Joel, I've seen things tonight. I can't even. Tommy's voice cracked, and Joel could hear the sound of chaos in the background. Shouting, sirens, the distant sound of gunfire. Where are you? Joel asked, already climbing out of bed, his parental instincts kicking in. Whatever was happening, his first priority was Sarah. I'm trying to get to you, but the roads are blocked. There's been accidents everywhere. And the police. Joel, just get Sarah and head north. Get as far from the city as you can. The line went dead. Joel stared at the phone for a moment, his mind struggling to make sense of what he'd just heard. Then he heard it. A sound that made his blood run cold. From somewhere in the distance, barely audible through the closed windows, came the sound of scream. Not the scream of someone in pain, but something else. Something that sounded barely human. He moved quickly, but quietly down the hall to Sarah's room, not wanting to frighten her unnecessarily. He eased open her door and peered inside. Sarah was still asleep, curled up under her covers, her face peaceful in the dim light, filtering through her bedroom window. For a moment, Joel hesitated. Maybe Tommy was wrong. Maybe this was all some kind of misunderstanding, some isolated incident that would be resolved by morning. Then he heard more screaming, closer this time, and beneath it, a sound that made no sense, a clicking, chittering noise that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Joel gently shook Sarah's shoulder. Sarah, baby, wake up. Sarah stirred, mumbling something incoherent, before slowly opening her eyes. Dad, what time is it? Late, Joel said, trying to keep his voice calm and steady. Listen, sweetie. We need to go somewhere. Can you get dressed quickly? Sarah sat up, immediately alert in the way that children can be when they sense something is wrong. Go where? What's happening? I'm not sure yet, Joel said honestly. But Uncle Tommy called and he thinks there might be some kind of emergency. I want to make sure we're somewhere safe. Sarah nodded, trusting her father implicitly. She climbed out of bed and began pulling on jeans and a t-shirt. "Should I pack a bag? Just grab your favorite things," Joel said. "Whatever you can carry." As Sarah gathered her belongings, Joel went to his own room and quickly dressed. He grabbed his wallet, his keys, and from a locked box in his closet, a pistol he'd owned for years but never expected to use. The weight of it in his hand felt alien and terrible. But Tommy's words echoed in his mind. People are going crazy, attacking each other. Downstairs, Joel quickly gathered what supplies he could. Bottles of water, some non-perishable food, a first aid kit. Sarah appeared with a small backpack, her expression serious but not yet frightened. She trusted her father to keep her safe, and that trust was both a comfort and a terrible responsibility. "Ready?" Joel asked. Sarah nodded. "Ready." Joel opened the front door cautiously, peering out into the night. The street looked normal at first glance. The same familiar houses, the same parked cars, the same street lamps casting their gentle pools of light. But as his eyes adjusted, he began to notice things that were wrong. A car had crashed into a fire hydrant 3 houses down, water spraying in a silver arc. A front door hung open, spilling light onto an empty porch, and in the distance that strange clicking sound continued, growing louder. Joel's truck was parked in the driveway, and he hurried Sarah toward it, his hand on her shoulder. "Stay close to me, baby girl," he said quietly. They had almost reached the truck when they heard the sound of running footsteps. Joel spun around to see their neighbor, Miss Adler, sprinting toward them across her front yard. But something was wrong with her. Her clothes were torn, her face was pale, and when she opened her mouth to call out to them, that horrible clicking sound emerged instead of words. "Get in the truck," Joel said urgently, pushing Sarah toward the passenger side. "Now." Sarah complied without question, her eyes wide with fear. Joel fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking as Mrs. Adler drew close. Up close he could see that her eyes were clouded, milky white, and there was something growing from her face, a kind of fungal growth that looked like nothing he'd ever seen before. The truck's engine roared to life just as Mrs. Adler reached them. She threw herself against Joel's window with inhuman strength, her fingers ending in what looked like claws. The clicking sound was deafening now, and Joel could see more figures emerging from the shadows, neighbors he'd known for years but transformed into something else, something that wasn't quite human anymore. Joel threw the truck into reverse and peeled out of the driveway, his heart pounding. In the passenger seat, Sarah sat frozen with shock, staring at the infected neighbors who gave chase for a few yards before giving up and wandering back into the darkness. "Dad," Sarah whispered, her voice very small. "What's wrong with them?" "I don't know, baby," Joel said. And it was the truth. He had no context for what he'd just seen, no framework for understanding what their neighbors had become. "But we're going to get somewhere safe, okay? We're going to find Uncle Tommy, and we're going to figure this out." As they drove through their neighborhood, they saw more signs of the catastrophe that was unfolding. Houses with their lights on but no movement inside. Cars abandoned in the middle of the street, and here and there, more of those infected people, wandering aimlessly or standing perfectly still, their heads tilted as if listening to something only they could hear. The radio crackled to life as Joel searched for news, for any information about what was happening. The first few stations were dead air, but finally he found one that was still broadcasting. Reports coming in from around the globe of what appears to be some kind of aggressive infection. The CDC is advising all citizens to avoid contact with infected individuals and to remain in their homes with doors and windows locked. Military personnel are being deployed to major population centers, and evacuation centers are being established. The broadcast dissolved into static, then resumed with a different voice, more urgent now. "This is emergency broadcast system. This is not a test. A parasitic fungal infection has been detected in major cities across the United States. The infection appears to be transmitted through bites or spores. Infected individuals display aggressive behavior and should be considered extremely dangerous. Seek immediate shelter and avoid all contact with infected persons. Sarah reached over and turned off the radio. "I don't want to hear anymore," she said quietly. Joel nodded, understanding. The clinical language of the emergency broadcast somehow made everything worse, more real. Parasitic fungal infection. The words seemed to hang in the air between them, terrible in their implications. They drove in silence for a while, heading north, as Tommy had advised. The further they got from the city, the more normal things appeared. But Joel knew that normalcy was an illusion now. Whatever was happening, it was spreading, and nowhere would be safe for long. "Dad," Sarah said eventually, "are we going to be okay?" It was the question Joel had been dreading. The question every parent fears they might someday have to answer without certainty. In the old world, the world that had existed just a few hours ago, he would have said yes without hesitation. He would have assured his daughter that everything would be fine, that the adults would handle whatever problems arose, that her job was simply to be a kid, and let him worry about the big things. But now, with the evidence of societal collapse all around them, with the memory of Miss Adler's transformed face fresh in his mind, he found himself unable to offer those easy reassurances. "I'm going to do everything I can to keep you safe," he said finally. "Everything. I promise you." It wasn't quite the same as saying everything would be okay, and Sarah was smart enough to understand the difference. But she nodded, accepting his promise for what it was. Not a guarantee that the world would return to normal, but a vow that he would fight for her, that he would never stop trying to protect her, no matter what came next. As they drove through the night, the radio occasionally crackling back to life with fragments of information, Joel's mind was already adapting to their new reality. He was no longer thinking like a man who expected to return to his normal life in a few days. He was thinking like someone who needed to survive, who needed to keep his daughter alive in a world that had suddenly become hostile to human life. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness ahead of them, illuminating the road that led away from everything they had known. Behind them, the city glowed with an orange light that spoke of fires and chaos. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also possibility. The possibility that somewhere out there, they could find safety, find other survivors, find a way to endure whatever this plague had made of their world. Sarah fell asleep eventually, her head resting against the window, and Joel drove on through the night. He found himself thinking about the conversation he'd had with his daughter just hours earlier, about her homework and her friends and her plans for the weekend. That conversation felt like it had happened in another lifetime, to another person. The man who had worried about whether his daughter was doing her math homework no longer existed. In his place was someone harder, more focused, someone whose only concern was survival. The sun was beginning to rise when they finally stopped for gas at a small station on the outskirts of a town Joel didn't recognize. The attendant was glued to a small television behind the counter, his face pale with shock. On the screen, Joel could see shaky helicopter footage of major cities in chaos, burning buildings, abandoned cars, and crowds of people moving in ways that didn't look quite right. "How long has this been going on?" Joel asked the attendant as he paid for gas and supplies. "Started yesterday in the big cities," the man replied without taking his eyes off the screen. "But it's spreading fast. They're saying it's some kind of fungus. Makes people go crazy. Government's talking about quarantine zones, military intervention." He finally looked at Joel, his eyes wide with fear. "What kind of fungus does that to people?" Joel had no answer. He gathered his supplies and returned to the truck, where Sarah was just waking up. She looked around, confused for a moment. Then memory returned and her face fell. "It wasn't a dream," she said softly. "No, baby," Joel said gently. "It wasn't a dream." They drove on, listening to radio reports that grew more fragmented and desperate as the day wore on. By afternoon, most stations had gone silent. The few that remained spoke of collapsed governments, overrun military bases, and something called cordyceps that was transforming human beings into something else entirely. Joel began to understand that they weren't just dealing with a temporary crisis. This wasn't something that would be resolved in days or weeks. This was the end of the world as they knew it, and the beginning of something else entirely. Something they would have to learn to navigate without maps, without guides, without any of the certainties that had once made life predictable and safe. But even as this terrible knowledge settled over him like a weight, Joel felt something else taking root in his chest. A fierce, protective determination. The world might be ending, but Sarah was still here, still depending on him. As long as she was alive, as long as she needed him, he would find a way to keep going. The truck rolled on through a landscape that looked normal but felt fundamentally changed, and in the passenger seat, Sarah watched the world pass by, her young mind already beginning to adapt to new realities, already beginning to understand that the life she had known was over, and something else, something harder but perhaps also more precious, was beginning to take its place. As they drove toward an uncertain future, neither Joel nor Sarah could have imagined the journey that lay ahead of them, the trials they would face, the people they would meet, the impossible choices they would be forced to make. They could not have foreseen that this terrible day when their old life ended was also the day when something new began, a bond forged in crisis, a love tested by the very worst the world could offer, a story of survival that would span decades and continents, and the entire arc of human endurance. But perhaps it was better that they couldn't see what lay ahead. Perhaps it was mercy that they were allowed to face each challenge as it came, to find strength they didn't know they possessed, to discover that even in the darkest of times, love could still grow, still flourish, still light the way forward. The infection spread with a speed that defied all attempts to contain it. Within days, major cities fell. Within weeks, entire countries went dark. The fungus, cordyceps, the scientists had called it in their final reports, transformed its human hosts into something that was no longer quite human. These infected individuals, driven by the fungus's need to spread and survive, became aggressive, violent, and utterly without mercy. In the early days, when people still believed the crisis could be managed, the infected were called many names. The media tried clinical terms like the afflicted or infected persons. The military used tactical language like hostiles or target. But ordinary people, the survivors who had to face these creatures up close, developed their own vocabulary. Runners, they called the newly infected, because they could still move quickly, could still pursue their prey with terrifying speed. Stalkers, for those who had been infected longer, who had learned to hunt more strategically. And clickers, for the ones whose infection had progressed so far that the fungus had grown over their eyes, leaving them blind but gifted with a terrible echolocation that filled the air with their distinctive clicking sounds. Joel and Sarah learned this new vocabulary through bitter experience. They learned to recognize the different types of infected by sound, by movement, by the particular horror each one represented. They learned to be quiet, to move carefully, to avoid confrontation whenever possible. They learned that the world had rules now, harsh and unforgiving rules, that punished the careless and the slow. But most of all, they learned that survival required a kind of vigilance that was exhausting to maintain. Every shadow might hide a threat. Every sound might herald an attack. Every moment of peace was temporary, fragile, something to be treasured but never trusted to last. They spent weeks on the road, moving from town to town, searching for some sign of organized resistance, some indication that someone, somewhere, was successfully fighting back against the infection. They found abandoned military checkpoints, overrun quarantine zones, and ghost towns, where the only movement came from infected wandering aimlessly through streets that had once been full of life. The world was learning new rhythms, new patterns of existence. Days were for traveling, for scavenging, for the careful business of staying alive. Nights were for hiding, for huddling in whatever shelter they could find, for trying to sleep despite the sounds that carried through the darkness, the clicking of clickers, the screams of the newly infected, the terrible silence that followed violence. Joel found himself changing in ways both subtle and profound. The contractor who had once built homes for families became someone who could hotwire cars, who could navigate by the stars, who could kill without hesitation when Sarah's life was threatened. The father who had once worried about homework and bedtimes became someone who could teach his daughter to move silently, to recognize the signs of infection, to understand that sometimes the most compassionate thing to do was to prevent someone from turning into something that would harm others. Sarah, too, was changing. The carefree 12-year-old who had once rolled her eyes at her father's jokes became someone who could scout ahead, who could keep watch while Joel slept, who could make life or death decisions with a calm that would have been heartbreaking in its premature wisdom, if there had been time for heartbreak. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about their journey was how their bond deepened rather than frayed under the pressure. Many families were torn apart by the crisis, destroyed by the impossible choices and constant fear. But Joel and Sarah found in each other a strength they had never known they possessed. Their love became a kind of fortress, a source of warmth and comfort that could not be touched by the horror that surrounded them. They developed their own language, their own signals, their own rituals of care and protection. A touch on the shoulder that meant danger ahead. A squeeze of the hand that meant I'm here, you're safe. A certain way of saying goodnight that meant whatever happens tomorrow, I love you. Months passed. The seasons changed. The world continued its transformation from a place of civilization to something wilder, more dangerous, but also in some ways more honest. The pretenses and complexities of modern life had been stripped away, leaving only the essentials: love, loyalty, the will to survive, the bonds between people that proved stronger than any disaster. Joel and Sarah had been on the road for almost a year when they first heard rumors of the quarantine zones, places where the military had managed to establish some semblance of order, where survivors could find shelter, food and protection from the infected. The rumors spoke of Boston, of Atlanta, of a few other cities where the walls still held, where life continued in some recognizable form. But the rumors also carried warnings. The QZs, as they were called, were not paradise. They were places of strict military control, where resources were scarce and freedom was a luxury no one could afford. People spoke of brutal enforcement, of summary executions, of a kind of safety that came at the cost of everything that had once made life worth living. Still, as winter approached and their supplies dwindled, Joel found himself considering the possibility. Sarah was growing up in a world of constant danger, without education, without other children, without any of the things that might help her become a complete person. Maybe the QZs weren't perfect, but they might offer her a chance at something approaching a normal life. "What do you think?" he asked her one evening, as they huddled around a small fire in the ruins of an abandoned gas station. "Should we try to make it to one of the quarantines?" Sarah considered the question seriously, as she had learned to consider all questions that related to their survival. "Are you tired of this?" she asked. "Of being on the road?" Joel looked at his daughter, seeing in her face the woman she was becoming. 15 now, no longer the child she had been when the outbreak began. Stronger, more capable, but also carrying burdens that no 15-year-old should have to bear. "I'm not tired of being with you," he said carefully, "but I wonder sometimes if you might be happier somewhere more stable. Somewhere you could have friends your own age, maybe continue your education." Sarah smiled at this, an expression both fond and slightly sad. "Dad, I don't even remember what it was like to worry about homework. That person feels like someone I used to know a long time ago." Joel nodded, understanding. They had both left their old selves behind, had become people their younger selves might not recognize. The question was whether that transformation was complete, or whether there was still some possibility of recovering pieces of who they used to be. "But," Sarah continued, If you think it might be better for us, I trust you. I've always trusted you. That trust, freely given and absolutely complete, was both Joel's greatest comfort and his heaviest burden. Sarah trusted him to make the right choices, to keep her safe, to guide them both through whatever came next. And he had proven worthy of that trust, again and again, through dangers and hardships that would have broken many people. But he also knew that trust was fragile, that it could be lost in a single moment of poor judgment, in one choice that put his own needs above hers. He carried that knowledge like a weight in his chest, a constant reminder of what he stood to lose if he ever failed her. In the end, they decided to try for the Boston QZ. It was one of the most stable, according to the rumors, and it was far enough north that the winter might help slow the spread of infection. They gathered what supplies they could and began the long journey toward what they hoped might be a new kind of life. The trip took them through landscapes that were both beautiful and terrible. Nature was already beginning to reclaim much of the abandoned human infrastructure. Vines grew through broken windows. Trees sprouted from sidewalk cracks. Animals that had once fled human civilization were returning to spaces that had been empty for years. In some ways, the world was healing itself. Without the constant interference of human industry, the air was cleaner. The water was clearer. The night sky was brilliant with stars that had been invisible in the light-polluted world of before. But this healing came at a cost measured in human lives, human dreams, human potential. Joel and Sarah traveled mostly at night now, when the infected were less active and the roads were empty. They had become creatures of shadow and silence, moving through a world that belonged increasingly to things that had once been human but were human no longer. They were perhaps 50 miles from Boston when they encountered the patrol. They had been walking along a rural highway, keeping to the shadows of the tree line when they heard the sound of vehicles approaching. Joel immediately pulled Sarah into the underbrush, and they crouched there, perfectly still, as a convoy of military vehicles passed by. The convoy was moving slowly, searchlights sweeping the road and the surrounding area. "Border Patrol," Joel whispered when the convoy had passed. "We're getting close to the QZ." Over the next few days, they encountered more signs of the military presence. Checkpoints, guard towers, patrols of soldiers in vehicles and on foot. The sight of so much organized activity was both reassuring and intimidating. After months of seeing only ruins and infected, the evidence of human cooperation and planning was almost overwhelming. But Joel also noticed things that troubled him. The soldiers they glimpsed were heavily armed, and their behavior suggested they were as concerned about threats from other humans as they were about the infected. The QZ was clearly a fortress, designed to keep threats out. But Joel wondered what it might be like to live inside such a fortress, whether the safety it offered was worth the price it demanded. They were within sight of the QZ walls when disaster struck. They had been moving through a wooded area, just outside the perimeter, when they stumbled into a patrol of infected. There were 6 of them, a mix of runners and stalkers, and they were between Joel and Sarah and the only route to safety. Joel drew his pistol, but he knew that gunfire would only attract more infected. He motioned for Sarah to stay back, then began to move forward, hoping to draw the infected away from her. But one of the stalkers had already noticed Sarah. It moved with the terrible, predatory grace that marked the more advanced infected, circling around to flank her while Joel was focused on the others. "Sarah!" Joel shouted, but it was too late. The stalker lunged, and Sarah stumbled backward, trying to get away. She fell, and the infected landed on top of her, its mutated hands reaching for her throat. Joel's world narrowed to a single point of focus. He could not let the infected touch his daughter. He could not let her be hurt. The thought of losing her, of watching her transform into one of those things, was more than he could bear. He shot the stalker at point-blank range, then whirled to face the other. The gunfire had attracted their attention, and they were converging on him with the single-minded focus of predators who had found prey. Joel fought with a desperation that bordered on madness. He had only a few bullets left, and there were still 4 infected between him and Sarah. He used his knife, his fists, anything he could get his hands on. He fought with the strength of a man who had everything to lose, and gradually, impossibly, he began to win. But in the chaos of the fight, he didn't notice the soldier who had been drawn by the gunfire. The young man approached through the trees, his rifle raised, his finger on the trigger. In the dim light filtering through the canopy, with adrenaline coursing through his system and his training telling him that anyone outside the QZ was potentially infected, he saw what looked like an infected person attacking a young girl. The soldier's name was Marcus, and he was 19 years old. He had been stationed at the Boston QZ for 6 months, and in that time he had seen things that would haunt him for the rest of his life. However long that might be, he had watched people he cared about turn into monsters. He had been forced to shoot civilians who showed signs of infection. He had learned to make split-second decisions about who lived and who died, and those decisions had slowly eroded something essential inside him. When Marcus saw Joel fighting desperately with the infected, covered in blood, moving with the kind of violence that the situation demanded, his training took over. The rules were clear. Anyone outside the QZ was to be treated as potentially hostile. Anyone who might be infected was to be eliminated immediately, without hesitation, without mercy. Joel had just finished off the last of the infected when he heard the crack of a rifle. The bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the ground. Pain exploded through his body, but his first thought was not for himself. "Sarah," he called out, struggling to get to his feet despite the wound. Sarah had gotten up and was running toward him, her face white with terror. Dad, are you okay?" "Stay back," Joel gasped, seeing the soldier emerging from the trees, his rifle still trained on them. "Sarah, stay back." But Sarah didn't listen. She never had been good at staying back when someone she loved was in danger. She ran to her father's side, dropping to her knees beside him, her hands fluttering over his wound as if she could somehow heal it through touch alone. Marcus approached them cautiously, his rifle ready. He was young, barely older than Sarah herself, but his eyes held the hard edge that came from too much death, too many impossible choices. "Are either of you infected?" he demanded. "No," Joel said through gritted teeth. "We're not infected. We were trying to get to the QZ." "Please," Sarah said, looking up at the soldier with tears streaming down her face. "Please, my dad is hurt. He was protecting me from those things. We're not infected. I swear we're not." Marcus studied them both, his training warring with something deeper, more human. The man was clearly wounded, clearly in pain. The girl was obviously terrified, obviously uninfected. But the protocols were clear, and Marcus had seen too many people die because someone had bent the rules, had shown mercy when mercy was a luxury they couldn't afford. "I need to call this in," Marcus said finally. "Don't move, either of you." He spoke into his radio, calling for backup, for a medical team, for someone with authority to make decisions about what to do with 2 uninfected civilians found outside the perimeter. While he waited for a response, he kept his rifle trained on them. Though his grip was less steady now, his certainty beginning to waver. Joel's wound was bleeding heavily, and Sarah was trying to apply pressure with her jacket. Her movements quick and efficient in the way that spoke of too much experience with injuries, with crisis, with the kinds of situations where quick thinking meant the difference between life and death. "How long have you been out here?" Marcus asked, more out of curiosity than any official need to know. "Almost 3 years," Joel replied, his voice strained but steady. "Since the beginning." Marcus's eyes widened slightly. 3 years outside the quarantine zones was almost impossible to imagine. Most people who ventured outside the walls died within days or weeks. To have survived for 3 years, to have kept a young girl alive for 3 years in the infected wilderness, spoke of a kind of skill and determination that was almost superhuman. "Just the 2 of you?" Marcus asked. "Just us," Sarah said softly, not taking her eyes off her father's wound. "It's always been just us." There was something in the way she said it, something in the fierce protectiveness with which she tended to Joel's injury, that reminded Marcus of his own sister, who had died in the early days of the outbreak. For a moment, his professional detachment cracked, and he saw them not as potential threats, but as what they actually were. A father and daughter who had somehow managed to survive in a world that seemed designed to destroy everything good and pure. The backup arrived within minutes, a medical team, and an officer who introduced himself as Lieutenant Colonel Hayes. Hayes was older, more experienced, and he approached the situation with the kind of calm authority that came from years of making difficult decisions. "What do we have here?" Hayes asked, kneeling down beside Joel to examine his wound. "Two civilians found outside the perimeter," Marcus reported. "The man was fighting infected when I arrived. I thought, in the darkness, I thought he might be infected himself." Hayes nodded, understanding. In the heat of the moment, with lives on the line, mistakes were inevitable. The important thing was that no one had died unnecessarily. "You did the right thing, soldier," Hayes told Marcus. "Better safe than sorry." Then he turned his attention to Joel and Sarah. "I'm Colonel Hayes. We're going to get you both medical attention, and then we're going to have a conversation about what happens next." The medical team worked quickly and efficiently to stabilize Joel's wound. The bullet had passed through his shoulder, without hitting any major arteries or bones, and while it was painful and would take time to heal, it wasn't life-threatening. Sarah stayed by his side throughout the entire process, holding his hand, whispering reassurances that everything would be okay. As they were loaded into the medical transport that would take them into the QZ, Joel caught sight of the walls for the first time. They were massive, built from concrete and steel, and topped with razor wire. Guard towers stood at regular intervals, manned by soldiers with heavy weapons. Searchlights swept the perimeter constantly, and the sound of generators provided a constant mechanical hum that spoke of a civilization trying to hold itself together through sheer force of will. "Welcome to the Boston quarantine zone," Hayes said as they passed through the gate. "I hope you're ready for a different kind of life." Joel squeezed Sarah's hand as the gates closed behind them with a sound like thunder. They had made it. After 3 years of survival in the wasteland, they had found safety, shelter, the promise of something approaching a normal life. But as they drove through the streets of the QZ, Joel noticed things that troubled him. Armed patrols on every corner. Propaganda posters warning about the dangers of infection, of rebellion, of thinking too much about the world outside the walls. People who moved with the careful, measured steps of those who knew they were being watched, who understood that safety came at the cost of freedom. Sarah was looking out the window with wide eyes, taking in her first glimpse of organized human society in 3 years. "It's so organized," she said softly. "Yes," Hayes agreed. "Organization is what keeps us alive. Rules, discipline, everyone doing their part. It's not perfect, but it's survival." Joel wondered what Sarah was thinking, whether she was relieved to see evidence of human civilization, or troubled by the rigid control that seemed to govern every aspect of life in the QZ. She had grown up in freedom, harsh and dangerous though it had been. Would she be able to adapt to a life where every movement was regulated, every decision made by someone else? The medical facility where they were taken was clean, well-equipped and staffed by competent professionals. Joel's wound was properly cleaned and bandaged, and both he and Sarah were given thorough medical examinations to confirm that they were not infected. The process was thorough, invasive, and left no doubt that the authorities took the threat of infection very seriously indeed. "You're lucky," the doctor told Joel as she finished her examination. 3 years outside, and neither of you shows any sign of exposure to the fungus. That's almost unheard of. "We were careful," Joel replied simply. The doctor nodded, but Joel could see the questions in her eye. How had they managed it? What had they done that so many others had failed to do? What was their secret? But Joel had no intention of sharing the full truth of their survival. Some things were too private, too painful, too necessary to be discussed with strangers. The bond between him and Sarah, the sacrifices they had made, the lines they had crossed, these were not stories for medical reports or official debriefings. After the medical examinations came the interview. Hayes and several other officials spent hours asking them about their experiences outside the QZ, about the infected they had encountered, about the condition of the world beyond the walls. Joel answered their questions as honestly as he could while still protecting the privacy he and Sarah needed. "You've seen more of the outside world than almost anyone," Hayes told him during one of these sessions. "Your knowledge could be valuable to us, could help us better understand what we're dealing with out there." "I'll help however I can," Joel replied. "But my first priority is my daughter. I need to know that she's going to be safe here, that she's going to have a chance at a real life." Hayes nodded. "That's what we all want. That's what we're fighting for. The chance for our children to have a future." In the days that followed, Joel and Sarah began the process of adapting to life in the QZ. They were assigned a small apartment in one of the residential blocks, given ration cards for food and basic supplies, and enrolled in the various programs designed to help integrate new arrivals into the community. For Sarah, this meant school, her first formal education in 3 years. She was behind in some subjects, far ahead in others, and possessed of a kind of practical knowledge that her teachers found both impressive and troubling. She knew how to identify edible plants, how to treat injuries, how to move silently through dangerous territory. But she struggled with algebra, had forgotten much of her history, and found it difficult to relate to other teenagers who had spent the outbreak years in the relative safety of the QZ. For Joel, integration meant work. His construction skills were badly needed in the QZ, which was constantly expanding and improving its infrastructure. He was assigned to a crew that was working on reinforcing the outer walls, and he threw himself into the work with the same dedication he had once brought to building homes for families in the old world. But even as they began to build new lives within the safety of the walls, both Joel and Sarah struggled with the transition. After 3 years of complete freedom, of making their own decisions about where to go and what to do, the regimented life of the QZ felt confining, almost claustrophobic. There were rules about everything: when to wake up, where to work, what to eat, when to sleep. There were curfews and checkpoints, and mandatory meetings where officials explained the latest policies and procedures. There were loyalty oaths and informant programs, and a constant underlying tension between the authorities and the population they governed. "It's for our own good," Sarah said one evening as they sat in their small apartment, sharing their daily ration of food. But there was doubt in her voice, a questioning that spoke of a mind that had learned to think for itself and was having trouble accepting easy answers. "Maybe it is," Joel replied carefully. He had learned to be cautious about what he said, even in private. The walls of the QZ might protect them from the infected, but they also had ears, and the authorities were always listening for signs of dissent or disloyalty. "But you don't think so?" Sarah pressed. Joel considered his words carefully. "I think they're doing what they think is necessary to keep everyone alive. But sometimes what's necessary and what's right aren't the same thing." It was a complex answer, the kind that acknowledged the reality of their situation while still leaving room for doubt, for questioning, for the kind of independent thinking that Joel hoped Sarah would never lose. She had grown up free, had learned to make her own choices, and he didn't want the safety of the QZ to cost her the strength and independence that had helped her survive in the outside world. As weeks turned into months, they gradually found their place in the complex social ecosystem of the QZ. Joel's work earned him respect from his colleagues and supervisors. Sarah's intelligence and adaptability helped her catch up academically and begin to form friendships with other young people. They had a roof over their heads, regular meals, medical care, and protection from the infected. In many ways, it was everything Joel had hoped for when he decided to try for the QZ. Sarah was getting an education, was surrounded by other people her age, was having experiences that resembled those of teenagers in the old world. She was safe, fed, cared for by a community that had resources and organization. But Joel couldn't shake the feeling that something essential was being lost in the process. The fierce independence that had kept them alive outside the walls was slowly being eroded by the comfortable dependence of life within them. The quick decision-making skills that had been vital in the wasteland were atrophying in an environment where all decisions were made by others. The deep, unshakable bond between him and Sarah was still there, but it was changing, becoming less central to their daily existence as they both formed other relationships and obligations. Part of him missed the clarity of life outside the wall. Despite all its dangers and hardships, there had been something pure about their existence in the wasteland. Every day had been about survival, about protecting each other, about the simple but profound business of staying alive and staying together. The choices had been stark but clear: live or die, fight or flee, trust or suspect. Life in the QZ was more complicated, full of gray areas and competing loyalties and the kind of political considerations that had seemed irrelevant when the only politics that mattered were those between the living and the infected. But Sarah seemed to be thriving in the more complex environment. She was making friends, excelling in her studies, beginning to think about what she might want to do with her life beyond simple survival. She talked about maybe becoming a doctor, or a teacher, or an engineer who could help improve the infrastructure of the QZ. She was planning for a future, and Joel knew that this was what he had wanted for her all along. Still, sometimes in the evening, when they sat together in their small apartment, Joel would catch Sarah looking out the window at the walls that surrounded them, and he would wonder what she was thinking. Was she remembering the freedom they had once known? Was she curious about what lay beyond the barriers that kept them safe? Was she content with the trade they had made? Freedom for security, independence for protection. If she was having doubts, she kept them to herself, just as Joel kept his own questions private. They had learned, both of them, the art of living with uncertainty, of accepting situations that were less than perfect, because they were the best available options. And perhaps that was enough. Perhaps it had to be enough. They were alive, they were together, and they were safe. In a world where such things could no longer be taken for granted, perhaps that was as close to happiness as anyone could reasonably expect to get. The first year in the QZ passed, then the second, then the third. Joel and Sarah settled into routines, built relationships, found purposes that gave meaning to their days. The sharp edges of their memories from the outside world began to soften, becoming stories they occasionally shared rather than experiences that shaped their every waking moment. But the world beyond the walls continued to exist, continued to change, continued to call to those who remembered what it was like to be truly free. And sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, both Joel and Sarah would find themselves wondering about the paths not taken, the choices not made, the life they might have lived if they had chosen different. These were the thoughts they carried as they built their new life within the safety of the walls, the questions that would eventually lead them to discoveries and decisions that would change everything they thought they knew about survival, about sacrifice, and about the true cost of the safety they had fought so hard to find. And so we've journeyed through the beginning of Joel and Ellie's story together. We've witnessed the world as it was before the darkness fell, experienced the devastating outbreak that changed everything, and met our unlikely pair as their paths first crossed in the quarantine zone. Joel, carrying the weight of 20 years of loss and survival, has reluctantly agreed to escort this spirited, immune girl across a dangerous landscape. Ellie, with her quick wit and hidden vulnerability, represents something Joel thought was lost forever: hope. Their journey has only just begun, and the road ahead will test them in ways they cannot yet imagine. The infected roam the overgrown cities, survivors have formed their own dangerous factions, and winter's harsh embrace awaits them with its own challenge. But that, dear viewers, is a story for another night. If you've found peace in this retelling and wish to continue their journey, Part 2 awaits you, where we'll follow Joel and Ellie as they traverse the beautiful, yet treacherous American landscape, face the infected hordes, encounter other survivors, and discover what it truly means to find family in the most unexpected places. Until then, let these opening chapters of their story carry you gently into your dreams. Rest well, and remember, even in the darkest of times, hope endures. Sweet dreams, and we'll see you in part